to our first full bucket course of the new year. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind you please to turn off your cell phones and put them away and turn on your cheek coils if that helps you. Today we are very happy to have with us this morning Professor Mike Guenther, the Associate Professor of History at Grinnell College. And as you can tell from the screen, his topic this morning is the hidden life of technology. So think about those 5 key words as he instructed you, and welcome, Mike.
Thank you so much. So the theme for this class comes from a course that I teach at the college regularly. It's one of the more interesting courses at the college. It's called The Evolution of Technology. It started, I think, about 25 or 30 years ago. I need to talk to Professor Calkin sometime about the history and origins of the class. But what's interesting about it is that it has one instructor, and I've been the instructor for the last few years, but then it invites a series of guest instructors. Somewhere between 8 to 12 faculty come in to both talk about technologies that they know more about, but also one of the more interesting things is to see how different kinds of people and different backgrounds and disciplines think about technology. So you get someone from anthropology, and they present a whole different way of looking at technology and the way cultures relate to it than someone trained in engineering or physics. And so we've had everyone from studio artists, people in religion, philosophy, kind of all around the college. And I think technology is one of those fields that spans the whole range of human endeavor and creativity, and so we need to kind of use all the tools, and I think I said in the write-up, all the liberal arts to understand it and its role in our society. So the challenge was to figure out how to squeeze that into 4 sessions, kind of that class. And so I don't know, I've tried different ideas. I'm going to try to do a balance of trying to make loftier, kind of larger points about technology while also focusing on the things themselves. Technology is a field that you can't get too abstract without losing sight of the things themselves, the physical objects. And in fact, and I mention the class because I'll sometimes be bringing it up to show examples of assignments we do or projects. I have lots of great pictures of different things that we've done. And so today I'm going to talk about, the title here is kind of Rethinking Our Standard Conception of Technology. It's a little bit broader, but I want to get into how we, as a society in the 21st century, think about technology, why it scares a lot of people, why a lot of people think that. In fact, when I invite people to class, the number one thing I get is, I don't do technology. Everyone's like, I don't understand technology. And I felt that way this morning when I was working on my computer. But technology is woven into all of our lives, like from birth, from the beginning of humanity, technology has been there. And so I want to think about how we got to a place where technology was seen as this image. Like when I talk to students about technology, if I could get in their mind's eye, most of them are imagining data centers, internets, cell phones, fiber optic cables, things like that. And so I want to kind of talk about that, how we got there today. So I asked you to think about 5 keywords. The way I always start off my technology class is I have students at the beginning, the first day of class, come in with this assignment. Tell me, what are the 5 words you most associate with technology? They can be adjectives, they can be things. Every once in a while I get a class that frustration will be the number 1 word. I've been trying to track this over, I've seen a huge change in teaching about this topic in the 20 years since I've been teaching. Like, there's just been a sea change in how people think about, in fact, I remember in this class in 2008, we were watching the introduction of the smartphone when the first iPhone was revealed, and the critics panned it. They're like, it's going to be a terrible device. It's a bad camera, a bad cell phone, a bad computer. Like it's going to be along with the AT&T picture phone. It's going to be on the trash heap of discarded technology. So I mentioned that story just to say that this is a field that's fast moving. Our reactions can be different to them, but this is the kind of a word cloud of the responses that my students gave this fall to it at the beginning. And I think it's pretty typical of what I've gotten for the last 10 years. So I'd be curious to know if this matches what some of you put or not. Yes?
first one that popped into mind was communications, and I don't see that up there.
Okay, so this individual said the first thing that popped in his mind was communications, and it's not up there. That's right. We have, I guess, the internet is somewhere, maybe a couple of responses in digital, but right, okay, so that's something that's surprising that's not on there. You have that, yes?
I don't see application.
Okay, no application here, right? Excellent. Okay, that was one that jumped to your mind.
Mathematics.
Okay, you would expect to see mathematics here. I think a lot of people probably presume that under science, which was one of the biggest ones here. Frustration was. What do we have? Science here, or medicine would be another area. Like, yes. Enough technology. That's it. I know. I think the fourth session we're going to get into some of the people that talk about the frustrations and the kind of Frankenstein side of technology here. So, and that's something I have seen a big difference. I think students are much more positive. In fact, words like innovation, that was the #1 word that my students chose this year to describe technology and things like that. They have a very different view than even, like I was saying, 20 years ago, where a lot of people, when they said technology, they'd say controlling, government. You know, there's a lot of kind of idea of technology as a kind of alien force that was kind of interrupting lives, losing jobs, things like that. But we have a set of words that I think if you polled throughout most of the late 20th century, these would be words that are popular in our popular conception of technology. So words like convenience, innovation, invention, advancement, change, modern, especially science, useful, things like that. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the picture that emerges, I think, like if you try to kind of poll people and try to understand about what they think of technology. I think some important assumptions, and I'll mention at the end where we get this idea from. But one of them I want to talk about is the assumption that technologies are modern. I sometimes also ask students to think about what is the technology the artifact they would most want to study in the class, or that best embodies technology. And almost no one chooses an item before 1960. You know, no one chooses a hammer or the spinning wheel or something like that. Which reminds me of Alan Kay's definition. He's a computer scientist I love. Technology is anything invented after you were born. Right? So this is one kind of conception. And I am very interested in that dividing line because we have a rich vocabulary in our society and in societies around the world and over time to describe objects. So is an object a gadget? Whatchamacallit? Is it a tool? Is it a technology? These are terms that each have different meanings, and as different groups are associated with them, who actually, you know, tinkerers versus engineers, things like that. But we have that idea. The complex, another quote I like from another, these are all engineers, but technology is anything that doesn't quite work yet. Right? So this is this idea that, again, technology to have that really special, and I think it is a shiny word in our culture. Technology is something very valued. It has a lot of cultural cachet. To do that, it has to be something incredibly complex. Even though engineers will tell you that the hardest thing is to make things simple and straightforward and streamlined, not complex. But these are the things that we think about. That's why we think about the kind of data centers and so forth. And then this idea about transformative. Ordinary little objects, little gadgets are usually that. They're considered kind of gadgets. Technologies are things like communication systems, railroads, airplanes, biotechnology, things that are seen as kind of transforming society. And those are definitely worth studying, but if that's all that technology includes, just, we're seeing a little bit, I guess one of the themes I wanted us to think about today is that we often think of the tip of a huge iceberg, of which we could kind of explore more. Another thing I want us to think about today is whether or not, when we think of technology, and I don't know if anyone thought of the term invention or innovation, it might not have been as much in this crowd, but I want us to think about the way stories, if you go to a bookshelf in a library or at Barnes & Noble and look for books on technology, they're almost always about inventors and the process of invention. And that's a really important topic. We'll talk about it. It's worth spending a lot of time and using all those different disciplines to figure out how does creativity work, what is the process like, what kinds of situations promote invention and a culture of invention. But it's only one little part of the life cycle of a technology. Right? A technology has to be used. Like, what if we spent more of our time focusing on how people use the objects in everyday life rather than how they were invented? Well, what happens to them in their afterlives? I'm going to talk about this a little bit on session 4. Where do technologies go when we're done with them? Like, do they go, we can talk about like studying where they go in terms of being recycled, being reused, the kind of environmental impacts. But I'm also fascinated with the way people collect them and use them as symbolic objects. There's a vibrant culture now, just to give one modern example of people turning computer chips, dead like hard drives, into jewelry, right? So they can have like earrings, bracelets, brooches. I'm sure all of you know someone who collects tools or objects, right? They end up in museums. These are things rich with symbolic and cultural meaning. That's also part of the life of a technology, beyond just its invention or its discovery, right? So we have, I think, a lot of different aspects to the life of technology that we could look at, that scholars studying this are trying to do more of. And it's a lot of hard work to track down how people use an object. It's a lot easier to go to Bell Labs and look at the records of the creation of the transistor. But we get a lot of rich insight when we study how people use them. How do they fix items? Maintenance, that's where a lot of frustration comes in, right? What if we made maintenance the center of the story that we tell about technologies? What would it look like then? So that's something we think about in the class. One theme that's very popular, goes all the way back to Aesop and his fables, is necessity is the mother of invention. Right? And the reason why I want to kind of emphasize this is I think it hits home these themes of usefulness, efficiency, practicality. And there's an idea that technology kind of just responds in an almost linear fashion to whatever we need. Like, we need better communication, someone's going to come along and create telegraphs. And then they're going to come along and decide that's too slow, and they're going to create radio, point-to-point radio. And then they're going to develop fiber optics. And so there's this sense that what really drives technology is just everyday needs, and us as rational, ordinary people just figure them out, chip away at them with a little ingenuity, and we figure the results. And what we'll see, and one of the things I want to talk about today, I'm going to talk about the history of computing and its kind of strange, non-linear history, is that that's not how technology actually comes about at all. It comes about often in the most unusual and unexpected of places, from people who are really eccentric and interested and passionate about developing a tool or a technique in one field, and then it gets applied to a completely different field to revolutionize it. So a lot of the greatest revolutions in communications came from totally separate fields. One of my favorite stories is fiber optic lines, like fiberglass, kind of came from a figure who kind of almost a mad artist, mad scientist, who used to light molten glass, attach it to an arrow, and then shoot it with a bow. So he'd create these super thin glass fibers and stuff. I mean, this is not where you'd expect the origins of fiber optic cables, right, to come from. But history is full of a lot of these really interesting stories. We often have tools and inventions before we know what to do with them. It's one of the big themes you see repeatedly in the history of technology. But again, I think it's kind of counterintuitive. And I don't mean to suggest that technology is not practical, that the drive for better batteries right now, for instance, isn't producing new technology, but I think I would be willing to wager that when the story of batteries, for instance, is fully told, that a lot of the key developments will come not from NSF grants necessarily about batteries, but will come from discoveries in completely different fields by people who had no idea that they were working towards that problem. So bear with me with that idea. We'll kind of see how it plays out in the story of computing. And I guess this is a corollary to it, but I think a really important one is that if technology is essentially a story of us trying to figure out how to do things more easy, more efficiently, more practically, meeting our everyday problems, it's also a story about kind of applied science. It's very kind of cerebral. It's, again, kind of very linear and predictable. It's about engineering and science and reason figuring out, here's how we build a better battery, and here's where we're going to get to that solution. And again, I'm not suggesting that science and engineering are in any way not important. Well, I would suggest that we often misunderstand science and engineering too, not looking at it as a human endeavor full of all of these passions and interests. So again, we'll look at that kind of today. And then this last point was, I guess, what I was trying to kind of emphasize in several of these, which is that technology is this really orderly story of progress. Like, that's a word you'll often see most associated in words with people. That it's about progress and advancement. It kind of marches along to the beat of kind of practicality and reason and science. And I'll talk about that, and lastly, I just want to point out, I find this always fascinating. The word technology itself is a very new word that we use. It really came into English language and use in the United States in the 20s and 30s. Before that, it was rarely used. There are some examples like the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But in general, technology was this kind of Greek word that meant the study of practical crafts. And it was usually confined to specific books like dictionaries, where you would look up the craft terms for a particular artisanal or kind of practical skill. And then engineers and scientists and industrialists and thinkers start to grab onto it in the 20s. And I think this is important. I don't want to make it sound like it was a conspiracy, but there was a belief that technology was becoming central to modern life with the development of radio, communications, electricity. No one could deny the importance. In fact, people were starting to, in almost like scandalous ways, suggest that maybe technology was more important than politics. Maybe it was more important than religion in terms of driving society. Maybe you could, as anthropologists were starting to suggest, divide societies up by their technologies, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Electrical Age. And so all of these thinkers were starting to imagine that technology might be the great driver of history. And the terms that were available to use at the time, the mechanical arts, right? Discoveries, improvements, the lexicon, handicrafts. It's kind of hard to say that society is driven by handicrafts, right? Or that the fate of nations depends on the mechanical improvements. So the lexicon that people like Abraham Lincoln spoke about, discoveries, the mechanical arts, all of that had seen, it didn't seem momentous enough to shape society, and it also focused the attention on something that people didn't like, which was handwork. Right? This was a world, to celebrate the handicrafts and the mechanical arts was to celebrate a world where ordinary people built things with their hands, they maintained them with their hands. It wasn't capturing what they thought was the exciting new feature, which was it was driven by science. It was things like electricity, electromagnetism. That was places like MIT that were developing engineers. And so they grabbed onto this kind of shiny Greek neologism, right, kind of technology, and started to use it to say that, like, you know, we want us to think about the world of goods and items, not as the kind of ordinary thing that everyone makes. All of us are technologists, right? Instead, technology becomes kind of a citadel of high technology done by scientists, engineers, the kinds of things that shape economies, that transform societies, that determine the course of empire. So there was a very kind of intentional shift in language that I want us to be thinking about. So when we do create those word clouds where we talk about science, usefulness, invention, these are all part of a kind of agreed upon shift in the very meaning of technology itself and the use of that term. Now, I always still use that term because I don't know of any other word I'd want to use other than that. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not suggesting it's a conspiracy, but I do want us to know that people at the time talked specifically, people like Thorstein Veblen and others, about how we needed a new word so that we could shift our public imagination away from dirty, greasy mechanics, people like the Wright brothers, you know, bicycle mechanics, tinkering with airplanes, to the new world that I'm going to show you of places like Bell Laboratories and others, where white-coated scientists were responsible. A lot of this took off, especially in the age after Sputnik, and the arms race and the technological race with the Soviet Union and stuff. So I just want us to keep in mind that the very term was born at a very particular moment, and it kind of was shaped by the ideological and cultural currents of that moment. And so I'm going to talk about the 50s in one sec, but one of the things I want to do is read, I hope you'll bear with me, I wanted to read a poem that I really like by Pablo Neruda, called An Ode to Common Things. It was written in 1954, right about the time that I'm going to show you when technology as a new concept was coming about. And I have my students often read this poem because I just think it kind of captures a whole chunk of that iceberg that we don't think about. When we think about technology as railroads, as jets, as supercomputers, we miss the kind of world that I think Neruda kind of talks about lovingly. So I have it up here so you can follow along with me. I'll try to read. I'm not very good at reading poetry, but I have a crazy, crazy love of things. I like pliers and scissors. I love cups, rings, and bowls, not to speak, of course, of hats. I love all things, not just the grandest, also the infinitely small. Thimbles, spurs, plates, and flower vases. Oh yes, the planet, it's sublime. It's full of pipes weaving, handheld through tobacco smoke, and keys, salt shakers, everything I mean that is made by the hand of man. Everything, shapely shoes and fabric, and each new bloodless birth of gold, eyeglasses, carpenter's nails, brushes, clocks, compasses, coins, and the so-soft softness of chairs. Mankind has built oh so many perfect things, built them of wool and of wood, of glass and of rope. Remarkable tables, ships, and stairways. I love all things, not because they are passionate or sweet-smelling, but because, I don't know, because this ocean is yours and mine. These buttons and wheels and little forgotten treasures, fans upon whose feathers love has scattered its blossoms, glasses, knives, and scissors, all bear the trace of someone's fingers on their hands or surface, the trace of a distant hand lost in the depths of forgetfulness. I pause in houses, streets, and elevators, touching things, identifying objects that I secretly covet. This one because it rings, that one because it's as soft as the softness of a woman's hip. That one there for its deep-sea color, and that one for its velvet feel. Oh, irrevocable river of things. No one can say that I loved only fish or the plants of the jungle and the field, that I loved only those things that leap and climb, desire and survive. It's not true. Many things considered to tell me the whole story, many things conspired to tell me the whole story. Not only did they touch me or my hand touch them, they were so close that they were a part of my being. They were so alive with me that they lived half my life and will die half my death. So I think that image of an ocean of things, touched by human hands, we forget even those hands, and his walking around, just kind of observing the world, in a curious way. I think we often, the definition was a little joking, but technology is that which happened after we were born. We forget the magicalness and the interesting, fascinating thing of all of the objects around us here in this room that all have interesting histories, all touched by human hands, all that we share together, that we have shaped and that shape our lives. Because technology is very powerful in shaping us. So I think that, I want that poem to be kind of in your mind over the next 4 weeks as we think and look about the history of things. Now I'm going to talk about computing today, which is not so much this world of common things, but in other sessions we're going to look at bicycles, typewriters, stirrups, and saddles. I think somewhere in here is... does he have stirrups in here? Spurs, yes, spurs, things like that, right? Okay, so we'll talk about a wide variety of objects and try to make them, I think, as interesting and as exciting, as meaningful to you or to the students. That's my challenge, to make them as meaningful and as interesting to them as they are to Neruda here. So, back to the idea of modern technology, right? And this is an image I like to kind of show in class, and I just love to spend a lot of time looking at that came from popular science, right about the time that Neruda was writing Technology on the March. And it gives us that perfect visual form of what we were just talking about, this kind of linear sequence of progress driven by scientists, and the idea that technology is basically just applied science, kind of marching forward into the progressive age of advancement here. And I want to focus, so today's theme, as I was mentioning, I'm going to try to kind of tell a history of computing that gets beyond some of these standard images, that makes it more interesting, that looks at the area below the surface of this iceberg. I just wanted to remind us of what most people, and probably many of you maybe were living through these images in some of you in the 50s. So these are from Bell Laboratory, which was by design. This was the face that the public saw of modern technology, and they were always men, often well-dressed, not always in lab coats, but wearing tweed all the time, working on science. I always loved all the images of chalkboards everywhere, kind of, which again isn't accidental. I mean, a lot of these shops were kind of messy in different areas, but the image presented to the public was that this was scientific discovery and innovation being applied kind of to the material world. And so people in the post-war generation who were following the story of computing and computers and information technology were presented this view of kind of technology as science on the march. and being kind of linearly, orderly put together. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are left out of that story. So one of the things that I think we can all think about and that's becoming public consciousness more recently are the hidden figures. And I'm sure some of you have seen the movie Hidden Figures, or I'm going to talk about some other kind of work in that vein. But the public face and the public tip of the iceberg of kind of engineering and science leaves a lot of interesting people whose skills and passions drove the world of modern computing. And one of the most visible, it's hard to believe that they were missed for so long, were women themselves, who made up the majority of the workforce and a lot of the technical aspects of computing here. And so they actually do appear in a lot of the images, not the ones just that appeared in Popular Science and others, but women were involved in a lot of the mathematics that was discussed in kind of Hidden Figures. In fact, if you look in the Webster Dictionary, I think it's not until the 1940s that the word computer is replaced. The original definition was noun, a woman who computes or does mathematical kind of calculations, right? Because even before women were involved in this kind of mechanical computing, they made up the backbone of most astronomical observatories, which are the places that had to do the most computing. So if you went to Harvard or other places, even as early as the 1880s, most of the staff would have been women doing these kinds of calculations. So we want to know a lot more about their involvement. Like how did their skill and expertise play a role in shaping the development? Because it's one thing to focus on kind of von Neumann or some of the key scientists. And again, I'm not trying to take away from their role, but they didn't create computers, right? They had certain ideas, but who are the people that actually built them and maintained them? I love some of the images of women working with vacuum tubes, all of the cabling and stuff. Like, it was incredibly complex work. And the more complex it became, the more it defied simple explanation. So that the engineers who designed it would be like, I don't know what's going on. I can't understand it, right? Like, it doesn't make sense why it's not working. You need to figure out how to fix it. And so women, other kind of male technicians, they were the ones that often fixed all kinds of problems. They were some of the first software programmers, often kind of figuring out things. One of the examples, Grace Hopper, who's kind of a famous woman in computing. I always love this story. Here's an image from the log for the repair of the Mark II computer at Harvard. And I don't know if you can read here, but it says, moth in relay panel, first actual case of bug being found. But these were physical systems, and these women had to know how to work them in humidity. Like, an engineer can design a system, but how do you know how the system will respond to different humidity, different temperature, animals getting into the system, bugs, things like that. So we have just a whole realm of skill and creativity and expertise, again, to translate a blueprint idea of a mechanical computer, even in the 40s or 50s, into an actual working system. We haven't even gotten into things about how to use the computer or what it could be used for. Like this, I want us to think about technology as a very collective process. It takes a lot of hands, a lot of skill to make it work. And so we have this story about women. Women were also central, and this is a picture actually of Grace Hopper on your right here, who was really important in developing some of the early software languages. A lot of women went on from the early mechanical work to, after they had shown to their male colleagues how invaluable they were, they often started to do more software programming or help design computer systems themselves. But I also want to point out that women were a really important labor force in high-skilled manufacturing to make the transistors, the vacuum tubes, the cables, things like that. A lot of this was skill developed during World War II in the manufacturing of the armament industry and things like that, but also took incredible skill, diligence, things like that. And so I think all of this needs to be a part of the story of the 1950s, of the rise of computing, like all these different groups that worked to create that. And here are 3 books that I think are just kind of an example of the newer type of histories of technologies that are more inclusive, more interesting, that cover a large array beyond just a handful of, quote-unquote inventors of computers. So I was mentioning, and some of you probably are most familiar with The Hidden Figures by Margot Shetterly, that focuses on African-American women computers at NASA that were involved in the space program and calculating launches, things like that, and wind tunnels. More recently, Liza Mundy's book on Code Girls, Some of this stuff was classified for a long time because it was wrapped up in military projects. So part of the reason we're realizing women's role now more is because it's becoming declassified. This book on the right I find very interesting, Marie Hicks. It just came out and it just won the award for Best Book in British History. Which I think for a history of technology book to win that prize is kind of unusual. I don't know of many that have done that. Mara Hicks's book, one of the things that's really interesting, you can kind of tell it foreshadows the argument in the subtitle, how Britain discarded women technologists and lost its edge in computing. One of the things she's interested in is if you look at computing at the end of World War II, it's not clear that the US would advance more than Britain. Britain had just as many talented mathematicians, just as much code breaking. It was really unclear why the US kind of leaped far ahead of the British in terms of the development of computing and its application. And her argument is that all these women who were trained during the war, all that skill set, they were pushed out in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, in order to make room for men in the civil service. They were thought like, all these men returning from war, they need jobs. Women shouldn't really be taking jobs that men should have, and so they were kind of systematically either completely pushed out of the fields or just confined to the lowest level. So you wouldn't have people like Grace Hopper or these technicians with dozens of years of experience working on computing. So I think she makes a pretty compelling argument that that really hurt Britain in terms. And again, I think it's a really good counterfactual history, because if you want to say, okay, women were involved, do they really help necessarily, or were they just doing manual labor like changing vacuum tubes? To look at two countries, one of which took women out of the workforce, one of which treated them as more of a skilled labor set, you see the different evolutions. It's kind of like a little historical lab experiment. You can kind of make some interesting, more compelling arguments based on that. So I want to bring up one example that I find also really interesting. It hasn't been written up in a book form yet, but the role of Navajo women in creating semiconductor chips early on here. And I think it's an especially interesting example. So I'm talking about the 1960s and early 70s in New Mexico. There was a large facility at Shiprock that was built for Navajo women to do, and I wish I had better images, and I wish I understood the process better, but apparently the technique of putting all of these tiny lines on a transistor chips and creating them without contaminating them, without creating problems, took immense skill and talent. And also used really creative things. One example of how technologies transfer from different fields is they used silk screen printing techniques from Japanese arts as a way to put the lines on transistors. So one of the things we'll see a lot in technology is when they hit an impasse, they often go to fields you would not expect, from music, art, all different walks of life to discover. Now, I think this is particularly interesting because the company that built it was Fairchild Semiconductors. And so I know a lot of people in the room will recognize Robert Noyce. Some of you that are newer to Grinnell or just haven't seen pictures might not recognize Noyce, but Noyce was one of the co-founders, along with 7 colleagues, of Fairchild Semiconductors in the Silicon Valley in 1958, I think, or something. And I love this picture because the foreground, we're supposed to pay attention to this group of all white-shirted PhD electrical engineers, and they are really important. I love studying about Noyce. But I kind of always want to zoom in on the background and see who are all these other people and what are they doing. If you're interested in Noyce, there's a great piece by the late Tom Wolfe called The Tinkerings of Robert Noyce. That was written for Vanity Fair. It's available online on the internet. But in it, he argues that the culture of Silicon Valley, the kind of culture of high technology, comes out of the world of Grinnell, Iowa, and out of Noyce's background here. So I think as Grinnellians, it'd be something you'd enjoy reading here. But Fairchild, under Noyce's leadership, decided to open up this plant in New Mexico. And here is from the promotional brochure attached to it, which I'll read and you can see up here. Weaving, like all Navajo arts, is done with unique imagination and craftsmanship, and it has been done that way for centuries. Building electronic devices, transistors, and integrated circuits also requires the same personal commitment to perfection. And so it was very natural that when Fairchild Semiconductor needed to expand its operations, its managers looked at an area of high-skilled people living in and around Shiprock, New Mexico. Now that makes it sound self-evident, but I was very surprised to see that the second semiconductor plant that Fairchild built was not in Silicon Valley, but on a reservation in New Mexico and using Navajo women. But I think we learn a lot from that quote about the recognition of the need of skill, imagination, craftsmanship. They were very drawn, as the kind of image above suggests, to, and this comes from the brochure itself, but drawn by the parallel between this craftsmanship of building these integrated circuits and the craftsmanship of weaving these rugs, the kind of hand skill, imagination, dexterity, and so forth. So I just want to point this out as just an example of we have lots of stories that have not been told about all of the people and the skills and the creativity that went into the creation of our modern computer industry, and that we don't think about when we only focus on those stories from Bell Labs of the engineers and scientists. And I think this story is particularly interesting to me because, and some of you may know this, some may not, but often the history of computing is seen as having a connection to textiles. Here I'm going to start to kind of go back and talk about where did, not only, the hidden story of computing is not only about some of the different groups that we wouldn't expect were involved collectively in creating computing as a technology, but also its long, deep history that would trace back for about 1,000 years. And it might first seem like, well, how can computers go back 1,000 years? We'll talk about how that is and what that kind of story would look like. So let me first step back 300 years, I think. I'm really good with math. Something. We're going to go back to around 1800, to the creation of the Jacquard loom, which I don't know if some people may have heard of, you may not have, but this is a kind of amazing weaving device that was developed around 1800 in France that used punch cards here to create an elaborate, complex pattern. So that rather than having to be used by human hands, the weaving of the pattern would be done by a machine, which had a series of hooks, and each hook would roll along that punch card. I'm sure, have some of you used punch cards in the past? Yes, okay, so unlike my students at campus, you are kind of ready for this. So punch cards, if we can trace it back to IBM and Hollerith in the census in the 1880s in America, but I want to go further back into where the idea first kind of appeared in the economy and in circles of government and so forth, which was these amazing Jacquard looms that could weave dramatically detailed pictures and images and patterns here. And I'm going to break in 1 second. This is an image of Jacquard himself. What's amazing is that this is not an engraving, this is a silk weaving that uses 10,000 punch cards to make this weaving. Here is an example that's at the Cooper Hewitt Museum. They used to make a set of tea towels where he would have both himself, his image, and his special loom at the bottom here. So I want you to get an idea of how much data and information we're talking about to be able to program a power loom to weave an image with that much detail and complexity. And I'm going to talk about how this became a spark to ignite Charles Babbage, who was often seen as the kind of rational scientific creator of the computer. I'll talk about him and I'll talk about its deeper roots, but we're about to break. Does anyone have a quick question before? We'll have a couple minutes here and I'll take a couple questions after the break and then we'll have some time at the end of the session. Does anyone have? No? Okay, well then we'll take a break and if you have questions you can come ask me now.
So that we can continue with our class and learn more about technology. Mike.
Okay. So I left off talking a bit about Jacquard and his loom. Again, this is about 1800 in France, and he developed this kind of revolutionary technology and the thing we're looking at is a machine that is programmable, that has figured out how to turn something, an image into a set of holes or a set of kind of coded data. And that's pretty revolutionary. I myself have spent a lot of time trying to explore how people thought you could turn a picture into data or into numbers. It's at the heart of our present information age, is that we assume we can turn anything into a set of coordinates or a set of numbers. And that story, which I'm not going to tell today, but would take us to Renaissance Italy and to the kind of artisan engineers of the Renaissance, people like Brunelleschi and Da Vinci and others who were interested in perspective and optical theory and thinking about turning images into coordinates and being able to manipulate them with geometry and things like that. So that's a kind of a different story, but I am going to continue to talk about the curious genealogy of computing and trace it back. So let me just say that the figure that if you were to open up like a Wikipedia article or Encyclopedia Britannica, in the history of computing, usually they go back to Charles Babbage as kind of the originator. He's a very important mathematician and scientist in England who spends his life building a series, or trying to build a series of two enormous mechanical engines that will calculate. Now, I wanted to point out that throughout his life, he was a follower of Jacquard, an admirer. He used to keep a kind of framed copy in his office of that Jacquard portrait and seemed to love asking people what it was. In fact, he would never tell them. They'd be like, it's an engraving. No. And he said, well, it's a painting. No. And he would just never relent to make them guess. But so this was a source of inspiration. I have a quote from one of his collaborators. We find women involved in computing all the way back in time. The Countess Ada Lovelace, who wrote articles and developed the first ideas about software programming. She was very important to the development of Babbage's machine. But I love this quote where she said, we can say that the analytical engine, this giant calculating thing, weaves algebraic patterns just as Jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves. So I wanted to point out that this was an important source of inspiration for Babbage. And in fact, all good scientists and engineers have their eyes open and are involved in lots of fields of life. And I mentioned the example of taking silk screen printing and applying it to microchips. Right? You'll see this a lot going on. So this is a reproduction or the finishing of the giant analytical engine that you would have a series of cams and pin cylinders that you would be able to crank it, and you would do polynomial equations with this. So one version involved all pre-programmed kind of camshafts. One version started to use paper cards, the analytical engine did, so that it could be programmed however you would like it to be. And so Ada Lovelace was starting to think, well, okay, you could program equations. We know that you can program images. Can you program thought? Could you somehow translate ideas into code? And we'll get into Boole and Boolean logic and some other kind of things that we're developing at this time in a second. But I wanted to emphasize this point that Babbage, had 1 foot in the world of science and engineering, 1 foot in the world of fabrics, looms, what Jacquard was doing. And he also had 1 foot, you can't have 3 feet. It's very sturdy that way. You can have 1 foot in the world of childhood delight. He was fascinated with automatons. And I don't know if you've heard that term, these are 18th century robots, basically, that were programmed with clockwork-like mechanisms that allowed them to move. In fact, Babbage, although he had an impeccable pedigree of Cambridge education and math and science, really what started him interested in that field was an 8-year-old visit to this man, Merlin, who's kind of like a magician of the Enlightenment. Merlin's Mechanical Museum, which was held in London. And Merlin, unfortunately, a lot of his items are scattered around. One of the things that delighted Babbage and people in his age, it still exists, is this silver swan. If you go home and you have access to the internet, I'd encourage you to look it up on YouTube. It's still around at a museum up in Northumberland, and they crank it and let it work once a day for tourists. And so there's lots of YouTube videos. But it's amazing. The silver swan sits, you can't quite see it here, but it sits on a series of glass beads that all rotate, so it looks like moving water. It has little fish that jump up and out. And the swan moves around, flaps its wings, and then it bites one of the fishes and kicks it up and swallows it, a little silver fish. So it has this kind of programmed, 2-minute long kind of routine. And so Babbage was just captivated with this kind of thing. Although I want to read a description from the time about Merlin in his shop. And so here's someone wrote, he produced a whole set of museum-quality clocks and watches. He built a perpetual motion machine that ran on atmospheric pressure changes. He built wheelchairs and weighing machines. His wheelchair is actually at Kenwood House up in North London, and it has a series of cranks that you can crank and it powers the wheels to move the person. He was the inventor of roller skates. He used to skate around his shop on them. He made automatons. Merlin was a harpsichordist and violinist. His musical inventions included a barrel organ and a patented compound harpsichord that Bach played. So when you can imagine what his shop must have looked like to all the people that traveled there looking for delight, looking for wonder, looking for engineering marvels, but especially for Charles Babbage as an 8-year-old boy. We don't know why, but Merlin apparently saw something in Babbage, or at least this is what Babbage says. Babbage in his memoirs recounts as going there as an 8-year-old boy and Merlin pulling him aside and taking him up to the upper floors of the house and showing him his prized collection of some automaton dolls that weren't on display downstairs. One was a young girl who would walk and curtsy. The other was a girl with a bird on her shoulder that would sing, powered by like kind of a pneumatic, air-blowing kind of device inside. And this captivated Babbage for the rest of his life, made him very interested, made him thinking about machines, about the possibilities. So I think in important ways we can trace the origins of his desire to create a computer, not so much to the world of his Cambridge education, but to this early childhood kind of fascination, opening up the realm of possibilities and of the imagination. And we also know this too because he later in life was able to purchase both of those automaton dolls when Merlin's store went up for sale. I think it was quite a bit later, it was like 1832, I think he was in his 40s. And he paid an enormous fortune. He kept them right next to his jacquard loom prints in his office. So these were things that were very dear to Babbage. And I want to talk about how they also are an important precursor to computing. So we're going to go into the world of kind of automatons, the world of wonder and delight, the world of 18th century court life, where these would have been displayed to aristocrats and to kings. And like I said, in ways that might surprise us, a lot of the 19th and 20th century technology and engineering around computing comes out of this earlier whimsical kind of culture of automatons. So Jacques de Vaucanson is a French engineer who becomes world famous for making these kinds of items. I should point out that he is the one who creates the first type of programmable power loom. Jacquard perfects it and decides to use paper punch cards, but Vaucanson developed the first one using kind of cams, and I'll show you what some of this means. But basically, we have not only through Babbage, but we have ties through Jacquard of how these kind of automaton, robot machine-like devices shaped people. And I'll show you a couple of videos of one. This was a famous one of a girl who would play this instrument, and she would play different tunes. They had one that was a chess player that was very popular. Vaucanson especially had these three, none of which survive today, but one was a flute player, one played this kind of tambourine, and one was a duck. It was incredibly popular. Louis XV loved this duck. He kept trying to want to buy it. You'll see the complexity in a second when I kind of show some videos. The duck existed all the way until like World War II and then it disappeared. This is an example of the duck sat on a, kind of a plate, but underneath it were these enormous camshafts, which contained all the programmable information. A camshaft basically being a disc that is very precisely cut with flat pieces and grooves, so that when a reader, a stylus, rolls over the cam, it makes the stylus move in a particular way based on whether there's a groove or a bump or something like that. And then that stylus controls one part. So some of these machines could have up to 800 styluses reading different things. So these machines, the eyes would move. They're very lifelike. I'll show you. I'll show you this one here. Pierre Jacquardrose is the writer. Jacquardrose was a Swiss engineer, but he spent his time in France in the court. And this is an example. This was one that Babbage also had read about that amazed people. I'm going to try, technology is not always my friend sometimes. I'm going to try, this is a device with 6,000 custom-made components. And in fact, if we wanted to carry this story out further, one of the things we could start looking at are who were the people that developed the tools to make these items? Like in the 18th century, who developed technologies to make discs so precise, to make brass work part of this comes out of the clock industry, but there's people who are very passionate about making tooth gears. I mean, imagine making a gear that has equal teeth, that has like 360 equal teeth on a shaft that small. I mean, this takes obsession almost with tool making and things like that. And so, again, we have a whole other realm of kind of activity driving technology in that realm. But let me try to pull up. So this is the
Inside
Rose
the boy
device.
are almost 6,000 parts. What's astonishing is that every one of these crafted components has been refined and miniaturized to fit completely inside the body of the boy himself. What Jacques Droz did was to use the technologies of homeostasis, of miniaturization, to build really a true automaton. Inside the little writer is all his source of energy and all the machinery that drives him. He works on his own. Great stack of cams. As these cams move, 3 cam followers read their shaped edges and translate these into the movement of the boy's arm. Working together, the cams control every stroke of the quill pen and exactly how much pressure is applied to the paper, so as to achieve beautiful, elegant, and fluid writing. With this sublime machine, Jacques Droz had reverse engineered the very act of writing.
So you can imagine what it must have been like for anyone, let alone an 8-year-old boy, to see this kind of engineering. And that was Simon Schaffer's professor at Cambridge of Science and Technology. But one of the things that he's interested in is that, as he said, the kind of reverse engineering, you're taking parts of human life activities like writing and trying to break it down into kind of an algorithm, a kind of set of programmable steps. And again, we see this not so much in the original world of computing or the world of kind of finance and things like that. We see it in this world of play and wonder, this world where people have unlimited resources and obsessive drives to create miraculous kind of technology that excites them, and then it gets applied into kind of other areas. There's also a lot of physiologists became very interested in doctors because they were thinking, what better way to understand the human nervous system and human anatomy than to try to build it yourself, try to recreate it. So doctors were very interested, and some of the very early theories about the nervous system come out of work in this field, these mechanical items, and later on when they develop electrical ones. But so I just wanted to show you that, because sometimes, a video is worth 10,000 words in terms of being able to see the level of intricacy, the level of passion that goes into making. And one of the things I want us to think about today as technologists, again, not as being kind of dry servants of reason, but people with passions, with obsessions, with desires, delight, wonder. These are all things that drive technology, just as much as applied reason necessity or things like that. Although there's nothing obviously very necessitous about this, right? I mean, these are the opposite of necessity, these kinds of devices. So, let me show you, so I wanted to show you that, and then I want to show just a very quick video of, this is Babbage's differential engine here. It's just a 40-second clip. I just want you to see it in action as well, to get a sense of, you'll see some similarities in how it works, but also just for us to marvel a little bit at the mechanical ingenuity and creativity that goes into these. So, let's see this. So this is him calculating a polynomial equation. I mean, not Babbage himself, but a modern person. You can see all the glittering spirals of cams moving, like carrying the different items. They can calculate to 31 decimal places. Although I'm not sure why that would be needed. And you can also, I think, in that image, see some of the similarities between that and the writer, like the stacked cams. You can see where computer early creators and people imagining what a calculating machine would be like. Yes, they get from the Jacquard Loom ideas about programmability, about data, but they also get from these automatons ideas about algorithmic creation, camshaft technology, or just even the sheer audacity of being able to think that you could create a machine that could do what the human mind alone was thought could do. And I want to take a step back even further, because I think traveling in this world of automatons and court magic is, to me, very interesting in thinking about the origins of computing. So I wanted to take us back to the Middle Eastern world, go to Syria in the 9th century, and then to Baghdad in the 13th century, with a series of really amazing books. And I should say, and I'm starting to say this, we could also talk about the Renaissance engineers, people like Leonardo da Vinci with his notebooks and others. But I want to go back to these books that appeared during the kind of height of the Islamic Enlightenment, the turn of the first millennium. These were books, the one on the left is written by a group of brothers that are called the Banu Musa, the sons of Moses. There are these 3 brother scientist engineers that live in Syria in the 9th century, and they create this book of ingenious devices, which is just an amazing book with all kinds of automatons, trick vessels where you pour 3 different colored liquids in. You watch them go down the same funnel, but then they come out separated. They have devices that won't release the liquid until you say a certain word. They have like all of these trick engineering devices meant to delight and entertain. I mean, sometimes technology is like magic, not because it's so complex and stuff, but because people are driven to do things because the sheer delight of seeing it done and trying to do that kind of thing. And I think even when I did the lecture on Gutenberg and typology, that some of you might have been here, one of the things that's fascinating about Gutenberg is how obsessed he was with the aesthetic quality. He wanted his print to look beautiful. He spent as much time. Yes, he was part of an entrepreneur. Yes, he was like an engineer, but he also had this aesthetic side that I think many technologists have that's important to think about. And then this other Islamic engineer, Al-Jazari, who writes about 300 years later, and I'll talk a little bit more about his book of ingenious devices, which has all kinds of things that don't appear in the West until usually about 800 years later. Things like camshafts is one. Something that is surprising to historians of technology, the crankshaft. The ability of a crank to turn reciprocal motion into rotary and vice versa, that doesn't show up in Europe until the 1500s. Like, even though Europeans could build cathedrals, they could do amazing things with technology. But you can't do a lot with steam engines or a lot of things without crankshafts. And so that took a long time. One of the things that defies the orderly progression model is that things just don't happen. Another example is people think, why did the bicycle take so long? We were almost had air flight. We had like steam engine trains, we had all these things, but no one had invented the bicycle. Or the typewriter. Why wasn't the typewriter invented in the 13th century? So there's these examples. And part of the answer is because human beings make these things, right? And human beings have their own passions and desires and goals. But this book would have all kinds of amazing kinds of oscillators and thermal regulators and other things. So they're really interesting texts that students of engineering, technology, and so forth always look at here. But I'm going to read a quote from one of the scholars that writes about this here. And then I'm going to show some images as I go along to describe them. Because I think this author, Steve Johnson, really gets at why these texts are interesting for our discussion today. So here's what he says. He says, but there is something else about these two books that doesn't quite fit the standard account of groundbreaking scientific or technological work. Something that is immediately visible to the non-engineer flipping through these pages. The overwhelming majority of the mechanisms illustrated in the two volumes are objects of amusement and mimicry. Fountains that spit water in rhythmic verse. Mechanical flute players. These are bellows that power this kind of mechanical pneumatic flute playing. Automated drumming machines. My favorite, a peacock that dispenses water when you pull its feathers. And then proffers a miniature serpent, you can see underneath the peacock's beak, with soap that provides here. A boat filled with robotic musicians that can serenade an audience while floating in a lake. So each of those figures on the boat is an automaton that plays different musical instruments together. A clock built into the shape of an elephant that chimes on the half hour. And then Johnson says there's something puzzling lurking in the genius of the Bana Musa and the Al Jazeera, these two texts, or two authors, sets of authors. How can it be that such advanced engineering expertise should be devoted to toys? The revolutionary ideas diagrammed in the pages of these ancient books would eventually transform the industrial world. But those ideas first came into being as playthings, as illusion, as magic. And so, and I should say that at the heart of all of these devices were these technologies of using cammed or pinned cylinders in order to translate motion into kind of programmable form. So all of these could be programmed like those automatons of the 17th and 18th century, which took them to an even higher level of sophistication and practicality and mimicry. But at the heart we find, if you think about computing as like being programmable machinery that can translate instructions into code and read them and execute them, right? We find them originating not in the world of mathematics or calculation or the world of industry or economy. We find all those key ideas and techniques and tools coming out of this world of illusion, of wonder, of amusement, of music. A lot of this happens. We could keep, in fact, keyboards, I'll talk about this a little on the next session, but keyboards themselves start off being called writing clavicles or writing harpsichords. Like they're designed from key musical instruments as a way to program items. And imagine using a computer without a keyboard, as an input device. So many of the key aspects of modern computing in terms of ideas, techniques, tools, and the models and inspiration come out of this unexpected world. And so these are the kinds of stories I think that we miss when we have that just tip of the iceberg view of just a handful of scientists designing UNIVAC or whatever kind of computing system in the 1950s, INAC, and so forth. But I also want to go back even into the modern world. I'm going to end here and make sure we have some time for questions. But I want to end with a figure that is in the citadel of that top of the iceberg, to mix metaphors badly, but a kind of figure who seems to embody, he shows up in all the pictures of Bell Laboratory, Claude Shannon, described by his biographer as the most famous, important genius you've never heard of. Like most people don't know about Claude Shannon. Some of you, if you work in computer information technology, may know of him. He's often hailed as the father of the information age because, for two reasons really. One, he was the person who suggested you could use Boolean logic to govern electrical circuits. So all the kind of programming techniques that we use to make modern electric circuitry come from his idea, which he proposed as a 21-year-old, like in a master's thesis. And then he wrote an article in which he created a set of equations and showed mathematically how you could use digital codes to compress information and translate it with perfect accuracy. So even if they're static on the line and you miss some of the digits, Claude Shannon developed coding techniques that it's fine if you miss 3 or 4% of the actual code because they're static on the line. He developed coding that allows that to still work without it here, and developed the kind of equations and the math behind it. So that's why he's kind of hailed as this towering figure of the kind of creator of the modern information age. I always love the images of him. Even this book, which as you can tell, a mind at play, like this. I find this very jarring with the image of this very severe-looking man with the gridded engineering paper and a kind of circuit logic diagram behind him. Or this is the statue of him at Bell Laboratories. There's also one on the campus of MIT, like kind of Claude the Thinker, right? Looking kind of serious. And so forth. But I want to look at him too and imagine, like, are there aspects of his life that we're missing or his work when we only focus on him as the kind of priest of high technology, kind of scientist and engineer? Well, it turns out Claude is a very fascinating figure. He's one of the few people to be inducted into the Hall of Fame for electrical engineering and for juggling. So you see him on the left. He also was an avid unicyclist and used to ride down Bell Laboratories hallways with his unicycle. And this isn't just a quirky aspect of his nature. He actually was interested in studying the physics and the mechanics and the feel of juggling. So he actually created what he called the unified equation of juggling. And claimed that he could actually juggle 4 items. He always wanted to get 5. He said his hands were too small, which was part of the equation. But he created automatons. This should sound familiar. Juggling automatons that would juggle items. He had to use a little bit of a drum to kind of bounce the object because he could never get a hand to do it. But this was someone who thought there was nothing wrong with a PhD at Bell Labs studying juggling, playing with juggling, studying unicycles, studying, he had a favorite, I'll show you a little pet mouse, Theus, a little mechanical mouse that he would, Theseus, I mean, to move through a maze. So he was someone who thought that it was perfectly acceptable, much like people like Charles Babbage and others, to follow his passions, to study, to try to build whatever delighted him and to understand him. And he's the person who gave us some of these major breakthroughs, and I don't think it's an accident. So let me take one of the important examples, which is Shannon's theory and equation of communications is basically about how you can, and he's the one, I should say also, that gave us the term bits and the architecture of 8-bit, 64-bit, all that kind of stuff. He defines all that, he lays out the groundwork, and at the heart of his idea is that all language should be looked at like probability. Like if I tell you, like, I walk the D-O, you don't really need the G. Like in the English language, D-O, that's 3 letters, is going to probably be dog, right? Or has a certain percentage. And so he played with the probability of language. And I bring this up because one of his favorite games that he would always play with his wife and his colleagues at Bell Lab was for them to omit letters from reading. They would sit around a room and they would read a line from Shakespeare. And they would drop the last 2 letters of every word and find out if they could still know what that meant. And this became a very famous game, and this is how he started to come up with this idea of thinking about language as probability and working through his ideas. So there's a deep connection between the mathematical, kind of scientific side of him and his playful side. And the same thing is true with a lot of these items. And I should say he was also an incredible tinkerer. He had this shop, and for time reasons I won't read it, but the description of his shop where he was building all these automatons, devices, whatnot, he seems right out of the playbook of Jacques Draws or any of these other people. This is his electromechanical mouse. Theseus, he'd put a piece of cheese, and he would invite people to build the maze however they'd like. Each of these can slot in or out, so he would tell people, you build the maze, my mouse will find its way through by bumping into the wall, and then recording that it bumped into the wall, then move it in a different direction. If it bumped into the wall, it would record that. If it moved the 3rd time, and it was free, it would record that it should take a left. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of bumping, and people at the time probably thought he was a little crazy with his unicycle and his programmable mouse, but he was interested in the idea of machine learning. Can we teach a machine to learn from its mistakes, to record them? And so once the mouse had made its way to the end, then it would do it the next time without making any mistakes. It would know exactly its path forward. So, and this is him underneath showing the kind of, and he built all these items himself, and you'll see this a lot with technologies. If you really want to understand things, try building them, try doing them by hand. Again, I want to push back a little bit on the idea that it's only applied science. I mean, there are pictures of him in front of chalkboards with equations and stuff. And I want to say that too because most scientists know that science itself is applied technology, right? It's about learning how to create the right experiments, how to use tools and equipment, how to set up things. One of my personal favorites is that he created a calculator to do Roman numerals. I would often, it kind of took me aback because I would tell students like one of the most important technologies was the development of Indo-Arabic numeral systems. right? So like you or I could give a number like 312 times 62. We line up the digits. That's a really big number, but we can calculate that. People in the Middle Ages could not calculate that. Because with Roman numerals, you have no system of decimation. There's no way. You have to either use an abacus or like the chancellor of the exchequer in England. It's called an exchequer because they had a big checkered cloth. They would put big markers on the cloth. It was like an abacus to use on paper. But ordinary people couldn't do calculations in the Middle Ages because Roman numerals can't be used that way. And so, but I was wrong. You can do them. You just need a good calculator like Claude Shannon developed. But in this thing, he was also thinking through about information architecture. And so each of these devices looks like both a kind of playful, whimsical, tinkerer device, but also helps them understand and create deep insights into the way we should structure information and systems. So this is the way he's often portrayed. Bell Laboratories, like the website, have him here with his equations, his general equations about the probability of information. The paper here, the mathematical theory of communications, is described as the Magna Carta of the information age. But I much prefer this image that was painted recently by one of the colleagues at Bell. Shannon with his unicycle, tossing smartphones here. And I'll end by reading just this one quote, and I'll try to do it quickly, but by his biographers, that book, A Life at Play. This is what they say: the internet, the digital age, the technologies that underlie it, these are all remarkable human achievements. But we can too easily forget what their origins are, how and why they are here, where they sit in the flow of our history, and what kinds of men and women brought them about. We think there's something important in beginning to learn these things. And that learning isn't just about understanding the substance of what's been built. It's about understanding the spirit in which it was built too. So many of the great sparks of innovation that made our world possible grew from the spirit of unbridled curiosity, creativity, and playfulness. They came from minds like Claude Shannon's that saw their work as a game. We think that's a spirit worth remembering. More than that, we think it's one worth living by. So I'll just end on that point. And I want us just to think about, in that same vein, like the vast realms of and qualities of technology that exist in the trial. So I'll end there. We have, I guess, a few minutes for question and answer. I'm sorry, it's a little long. But, yes?
Any of the...
Sorry. Please use the mic up close to your mouth.
The books, can you hear me? The books that you showed from the 8th century and from the 13th century, is there any evidence that those things were actually created?
There is. Not all of them, but there is evidence, like textual evidence at the time from scholars who study it, that several, or not even several, dozens of the items were created in their accounts. Other ones we're not sure about. Other ones were created later. But we also know that they eventually make their way to the West by the 15th century and have some impact. But we don't know all of them were, but many were, yeah. Good question. Yes. Sorry, I guess we have a microphone coming right to you.
Are there any books on these mechanical gizmos that you were showing us earlier, written in English? They look like they'd be fascinating to read about.
Yes, so I will make a suggested reading list that I'll pass out. I just didn't get around to it, but there are definitely some very good books about mechanical wonders that are entertaining to read. There's also some good website items as well, but yes, no, I think they're fascinating. And they were, people like Diderot, Voltaire, like kings, philosophers, scientists, they were all interested in them, and they're just fascinating on their own right. So they're, yeah.
I can remember when JR came and did a program on China.
Okay.
And how we, have grown up being so Western that we don't realize that in other parts of the world, they were developing boats and all kinds of stuff,
Right.
And here these folks in the Middle East were,
No, and I'm going to try to get into that a little bit next week as well, but I think that telling stories about technology that include both different groups of people, but also different regions, that it's not just a story of Western technology. There's a lot of technological transfer from all parts of the globe, and that every device in some ways is almost a testament to collective creativity. Little pieces come from all around the world, crankshafts, things like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about stirrups that come from Asia and transform Western society. So I think personally it's a more interesting and fascinating story to see that it's kind of a global tale.
You mentioned, but you didn't, I don't think, emphasize that there are aesthetic elements that often come into play. And a good example of that is Jobs and his work with Apple. How often his work was influenced by the fact that he thought certain things were ugly, and he wouldn't do it.
Right.
He would fight with his engineers, and he won. And generally speaking, his decisions seem to be sound.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great point about Apple and design culture. And a personal favorite book of mine is Eugene Ferguson's book. It was an engineering professor at Duke, I believe, called In the Mind's Eye. And he was an engineer for many years, practicing engineer, then trained engineers. And he talked about the aesthetic qualities of engineering and also the importance of the sensory aspects, like being able to draw things, being able to hear them. But the aesthetic qualities, that engineers like designs, and what works and what feels good is what looks good or feels good. Yeah, those qualities are really important. So I shouldn't set up a false dichotomy that I've been kind of making straw men of scientists and engineers, right? That they're not the only people. But I think when you really look at scientists and engineers too, they have exactly the same complex set of desires and goals. So aesthetics definitely drives. James Watts did some really interesting things with the development of his steam engine, with an elliptical solar, it's hard to explain, but a particular kind of crankshaft, which he just loved to look up at. So the wheel runs on the outside of the crankshaft. It's totally how you wouldn't do it. And he told his investors he did that because the crankshaft they normally would use was patented. But that wasn't really true. He just really loved to look at this beautiful gold kind of thing. And he thought it was an elegant solution. So the idea of elegance, and this is true with mathematicians too, right? Elegant, beautiful solutions that appeal to them aesthetically. The same thing you see with technologists. They just love the way a particular thing works. So yeah, the sensory aspects are very important. And then maybe George can have the, yeah.
It's really short.
Okay. And I will stay around to answer questions, yeah.
Mike, you've done a good job of showing how things hitherto unrelated get juxtaposed and you have creativity. In the depth that you go into in this course, would you say that's the essential, most common part of creativity? Is this bringing together unrelated things that now suddenly work together?
I think so. I mean, I feel it's hard-pressed to make a statement about what spawns creativity. But in general, in my classes, I do find that that's a repetitive theme, a theme that you see throughout history, and a lot of people emphasize that creativity is about combinations and combining things that had never been combined before, or taking an item from a very different field to revolutionize the design. That seems to be the kind of idea, and that's what Steve Jobs and others kind of emphasized, that these people need to have breadth. They need to have interest in many different fields so that they can pull from, in his case, sometimes like calligraphy classes or aesthetic classes and things like that. So I think there's probably some other things that could be emphasized, but yes, that's something that comes up a lot in my class as a spark.
Mike, thank you so much for opening our eyes to so much of this that, as far as I'm concerned, we never were thinking about. Let's show him our for the second session. Remember to turn on your cell phones and turn off your TV. Thank you. See you next week.